All right. So today's lesson deals with the hormonal regulation of blood sugar. Now, why is blood sugar important? Well, sugar, as we know, acts as a fuel for us to make ATP through cellular respiration. And ATP is used by every cell in our body for pretty much every cellular function, okay? And that sugar is carried by the blood. But once the sugar gets to our cells, it needs to actually come out of the blood and be transported into the cells. And that's where the pancreas comes in. Now, the pancreas is an organ located in your abdomen right behind your stomach. And the pancreas is very important in a few different areas. Number one, it acts as an exocrine gland. So we discussed the difference between endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Okay, an exocrine gland is a gland that secretes substances other than hormones, okay, into ducts. So, for example, we talked about the mammary glands, we talked about sweat glands, right? Those are exocrine glands. Now, the pancreas, it secretes pancreatic juice into a duct that delivers it to the small intestine, okay, to the duodenum, which is the first section of the small intestine. So in that case, the pancreas acts as an exocrine gland because those pancreatic juices do not go into your blood. They're not hormones, they digest your food, okay? Now, the pancreas also has clusters of cells located throughout the tissue called the islets of Langerhans. Okay, so the islets of Langerhans are these little islands, basically these clusters of cells that are found throughout the pancreas, and that's where the hormones are produced and secreted from. Okay, now in this case, the islets of Langerhans act as the endocrine glands, and they produce two hormones which are secreted into the blood that deal with the regulation of blood sugar. So when we eat a meal, our digestive system takes care of breaking down the macromolecules into their component parts, right? Proteins are broken down into amino acids. Fats and lipids are broken down into glycerol and fatty acids, right? And carbohydrates, if we can digest them, are broken down into monosaccharides, and those monosaccharides get absorbed into our bloodstream. So right after a meal, especially if it's rich in sugar, which a lot of our meals, contain added sugar, right? Especially like really simple sugars like fructose, it doesn't even have to be broken down in our small intestine. It's easily absorbed very quickly. And what happens is our blood sugar levels spike, okay? And this is known as hyperglycemia. There's that prefix again, right? We saw this with the thyroid. We had hyperthyroidism, right? It's an overproduction of thyroxine. So when we see this prefix hyper, it means more than homeostatic levels, okay? So hyperglycemia is when we have very high blood sugar levels. So for example, after a sugary meal. Also, there are hormones that increase our blood sugar levels. We've talked about a few of them. Thyroxine being one of them, right? Increases our blood sugar levels. Cortisol, epinephrine, these are all hormones that increase our blood sugar levels and cause our sugar levels to spike. So anything that causes our sugar levels to rise above normal, okay, this condition is known as hyperglycemia. Now, prolonged high blood sugar levels. So if our blood, if you have a functioning pancreas and everything's working, when you do eat a sugary meal or when your blood sugar levels do rise and you're hyperglycemic, then your pancreas will secrete a hormone to bring those sugar levels down. Okay, but if for whatever reason you can't deal with high blood sugar levels, then hyperglycemia can be long lasting, and that can cause all sorts of damage. Okay, so hyperglycemia can cause serious long-term problems like blindness, kidney disease, nerve damage, cardiovascular disease, increased incidence of strokes, heart attacks, okay, circulatory problems. So it's imperative that our bodies restore balance after our sugar levels spike. Now, the job of restoring balance as far as blood sugar levels are concerned is done by the hormone insulin. Insulin is secreted by cells in the islets of Langerhans called beta cells. So let me explain this one more time. Okay, so we have our pancreas, right? Inside the pancreas are these clusters of cells called the islets of Langerhans. And the islets of Langerhans are made of two kinds of cells, alpha cells and beta cells. So they exist together within these islets. Now the beta cells, they are responsible for monitoring your blood sugar and responding to hyperglycemia. So when your blood sugar levels rise beyond a normal level, then the beta cells will release insulin into the bloodstream. Now, insulin is a protein hormone. So hopefully you guys remember the difference between steroid hormones and protein hormones. Protein hormones, can they go through the lipid bilayer? No, right? They are polar. Our cell membrane has a non-polar middle, which doesn't allow them to go through. So they have to have receptors, okay? So on various cells in our body, there are insulin receptors in the cell membrane, especially the muscles, the liver, and our fat cells. Okay, they have lots and lots of these insulin receptors. Insulin goes into the blood, travels all over our body, and binds to these receptors. Okay, so the insulin binds to these insulin receptors on the surface of the cell. So your target tissue for insulin here, you guys, would be muscle, fat, and liver cells. And once insulin binds to those insulin receptors, it activates glucose transporters. Now, what glucose transporters do is they grab the sugar out of your blood, the glucose out of your blood, and transport them into the cell. Now, if you're very active, okay, let's say, after your sugary meal, you go out and you work out, or you play soccer, or you play basketball, or whatever, okay, that sugar into your cells, and your cells put that sugar through cellular respiration, make ATP, and you use that ATP for cellular processes. But what if you aren't doing anything? What if you're just sitting, watching TV and, drinking a Slurpee, eating some Krispy Kreme donuts, and where does that sugar go? Well, our bodies evolved to hang on to sugar. Okay, we don't get rid of it. Our ancestors, sometimes they didn't eat for 3 or 4 days, even longer. So we have evolved to hang on to that sugar and store it. Now we can store the sugar in 2 different ways. Number one, as glycogen, right? There's that carbohydrate again, glycogen. Where do we find most of our glycogen stores? Muscles, liver. Okay, but we only have so much shelf space for glycogen. We can only store so much. Once the glycogen stores are full, we don't get rid of the sugar. Okay, we keep on storing it, but what do we store it as? Fat. Okay, in our adipose tissue, in our fat cells. All right, so glucose, once it's in our body, it's either burnt in cellular respiration, okay, or it's stored as either glycogen or fat. All right, so once the glucose transporters are activated by binding to insulin, glucose can then enter into the cell from the bloodstream, where it's either used to make ATP, stored as glycogen, or stored as fat. So when the sugar moves out of your blood into your cells, what's going to happen to your blood sugar levels? They're going to drop. And when the blood sugar levels drop, this signals the pancreas to stop insulin secretion. Okay, and that's the negative feedback. Okay, so insulin levels go up when blood sugar levels go up. Insulin causes the sugar to be removed from the blood and go in the cells. Blood sugar levels drop. That signals the beta cells to stop producing insulin. So that's how insulin is regulated. Now, as sugar is used up by your cells, right? Insulin is opening those transporters, allowing sugar to move from your blood into the cells, so your blood sugar levels are going to drop. If blood sugar levels drop below normal, what's the prefix for below? Hypo. This is called hypoglycemia. All right, so blood sugar levels that are below normal, this is called hypoglycemia. Now, I mentioned hyperglycemia is dangerous, but it's dangerous more over the long term. You have to have prolonged high blood sugar levels to cause all those damages that I was talking about. Hypoglycemia, on the other hand, is a much more immediate problem. If your blood sugar levels drop too low, you can actually go unconscious and you can die. This is a serious condition. Now, again, most of us, we have, functioning pancreas that kind of takes care of our sugar levels for us. But if you are somebody who suffers from diabetes, for example, and you were to take too much insulin, right? Diabetics have to take an external source of insulin. That can, take a lot of the sugar out of your blood, cause you to become very hypoglycemic, and it can cause you to go into a diabetic coma. Some people, are very sensitive to their sugar levels, even though they're not diabetic. And if you haven't eaten in a while, it can cause you to become very lightheaded, right? It's kind of hard to think. Your vision might get a little bit blurry, and you may faint, right? And generally, give you something very sugary to try and bring your blood sugar levels back up, which is going to bring your blood pressure up and that sort of thing. Okay? So when our blood sugar levels drop below normal, there's another hormone that's involved, and that's called glucagon. And glucagon is secreted by another cell in the islets of Langerhans called the alpha cells. Okay? So let me say this one more time because it's a bit confusing. The islets of Langerhans are scattered throughout the pancreas. They're composed of two cells. Beta cells secrete insulin, alpha cells secrete glucagon. Okay? Glucagon works in the opposite way of insulin. So glucagon is going to cause glycogen to be converted to glucose and dumped into your bloodstream. Okay? So if you haven't eaten a meal, all day long, right? Your blood sugar levels are starting to tank. You become hypoglycemic. Glucagon gets released, goes into those glycogen stores and says, hey, we need some simple sugar. Break apart the bonds in the glycogen and increase your blood sugar levels. Okay? So it does the opposite of insulin. What do we call two hormones that work in opposition of one another to maintain homeostasis? Antagonistic. So insulin and glucagon are antagonistic hormones. Now, we saw this with parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. And I use the analogy of a teeter-totter in a playground, right? Here's another analogy for antagonistic hormones, a tug of war. So if blood glucose levels, homeostatic blood glucose levels is right in the middle, right? If blood glucose levels get too high, insulin starts to tug. If blood glucose levels get too low, then glucagon starts to tug the opposite way. And by these two hormones working in opposition of each other, we, on average, keep our blood sugar levels right in the middle. Okay? So these two hormones are antagonistic hormones, and they work in direct opposition to one another to maintain that homeostatic balance. Now, the disorder most commonly associated with the pancreas is a disorder called diabetes mellitus. Now, there are many forms of diabetes. There's something called diabetes insipidus, which has to do with another hormone. There's gestational diabetes, which can happen to pregnant women. And then there's diabetes mellitus. Now, mellitus in Latin actually means honey or sweet. And what this name refers to is kind of how this is diagnosed. And one of the definitive tests for diabetes mellitus is to test your urine for sugar. There should be no sugar in a healthy person's urine. Okay, sugar, it ends up in the filtrate early on in the urine formation process, but it's all transported back into the blood in a healthy person. Okay, somebody who is chronically hyperglycemic, they have so much sugar in your blood that it ends up in the urine and it doesn't get transported back. Okay, and it ends up leaving the body. So sugar in the urine is a definitive test for diabetes. Now, someone who is suffering from diabetes mellitus would have an inadequate production of insulin for a couple of different reasons. Okay, usually it's due to a deterioration of the beta cells, which are responsible for secreting insulin. Now, this can be caused by a number of different factors. So the beta cells can actually break down because of an autoimmune disorder, which is sometimes triggered by a viral infection in childhood. So some doctors think that diabetes, especially the diabetes that affects children, happens because a child might, have come into contact with a virus. That virus may have triggered the immune system to act, inappropriately and start attacking your body's own tissues. That's what an autoimmune disorder is. And in this case, the immune system would attack those beta cells and destroy them. Once they're gone, no more insulin. Okay. Other factors, including a lifestyle, diet, okay, genetics sometimes, might also contribute to the development of diabetes mellitus. Now, without insulin, the cells become less permeable to glucose and the sugar is trapped in the blood. So you might be eating all of these sugary meals, but the sugar can't get into your cells. It's trapped in your blood. Now remember, guys, what's the primary purpose of sugar? It's for our cells to burn as fuel. So if that sugar is trapped in your blood, it's not getting into your cells. So what are some of the symptoms of that? You're going to lose a lot of weight, right? Even though you're eating like crazy, you're hungry, you're eating, you're going to lose weight. Why is that? Because your cells start to burn the proteins that make them up because they're not getting sugar for energy, right? So your muscles start to break down. Your fat starts to break down. Okay, you're going to go to the bathroom all the time because you have all this sugar in your filtrate. That's going to draw water into your urine. Okay, so people who are developing diabetes, they might have 2 or 3 times the amount of urine that somebody who's healthy might have, and they're thirsty all the time, trying to replace that water. Okay. So if you have any of these symptoms or you know anybody who has any of these symptoms, you need to go to the doctor immediately. Now, there are generally 2 types of diabetes mellitus. Type 1 diabetes, this is what I was telling you about earlier with this idea of an autoimmune response that destroys the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans. This is usually presented in childhood or early adolescence. And the outcome of type 1 diabetes is insufficient production of insulin by those beta cells. And people that develop type 1 diabetes have to take daily shots of insulin, okay, or they need to use an insulin pump to get their insulin. So their pancreas doesn't secrete adequate amounts of insulin. Now, if you're taking shots of insulin, this can be, up to 3-4 times a day. An insulin pump is constantly connected to you, monitoring your blood and adjusting your insulin intake. So people with type 1 diabetes, they have to constantly monitor their diet, they have to constantly monitor their blood sugar level and take the appropriate amount of insulin. And there's no cure right now for this. So this is, you have this for your entire life. Now, type 2 diabetes, this generally develops over time and usually presents in adulthood. We used to typically think of type 2 diabetes as an old person's disease. You would get this when you were elderly, after a lifetime of having to deal with sugar, right? Eventually what would happen is the beta cells would kind of wear out and they wouldn't produce as much insulin, or those receptors, the receptors I was telling you about on the outside of the cell, they would wear out. Now, unfortunately, because our lifestyle has changed so much over the past 50 years, we're seeing type 2 diabetes increase dramatically in the world, and it's hitting people that are younger and younger and younger. So if you have a diet that's very high in sugar, if you don't burn that sugar by exercising and moving around, and your insulin has to constantly be pumped out of your beta cells to deal with this sugar, eventually that could lead to diabetes. Okay, so diet that's poor, very high in refined sugar. Okay, obesity, and a sedentary lifestyle. Sedentary means you don't move very much and you don't burn that extra sugar. Okay, unfortunately, certain ethnic groups seem to be more prone to type 2 diabetes than other groups. Now, early stages of type 2 diabetes, if it's caught early enough, okay, you go to your doctor and your doctor's like, you're pre-diabetic. You got to do something about this. If you lose weight, if you change your lifestyle, you can actually turn this around, okay? But if you don't, this can develop into insulin-dependent diabetes, okay, where you have to take insulin shots every day, just like a type 1 diabetic, okay? Now, diabetes in and of itself is a problem, okay? It's a concern, but there are many things that can happen because of prolonged hyperglycemia. So if you have too much sugar in your blood because you don't produce enough insulin, if your blood sugar level is high all the time, it's going to cause things like neuropathy. What's neuropathy? It's nerve damage, especially in your lower extremities, like your legs and your feet. Okay, so you don't feel things. You don't feel injuries. Your feet and legs might tingle. They might hurt. You might feel pins and needles. Okay, numbness. Arterial sclerosis. This is a hardening of the arteries. And along with the hardening of the arteries comes formation of plaques from cholesterol, and that can lead to heart attacks and strokes. Okay, nephropathy. Nephropathy is damage to the little kidney tubules, to the nephrons, because of prolonged high blood pressure and damage to the blood vessels. Diabetic retinopathy, we talked about this when we discussed the eye. The little blood vessels of the choroid that supply your rods and cones with oxygen and nutrients, they become leaky. And once they become leaky, they don't deliver that oxygen and nutrients to the rods and cones, and they will die. This is the leading cause of blindness in Canada. Okay, diabetic retinopathy. Prolonged high blood sugar levels will lower your immune response, which can lead to impaired healing and increased risk of infections. So people that have diabetes, they have to be very careful, especially with their feet. Number one, they might injure themselves, get a blister or a cut on the bottom of their foot or something, and not feel it because of the neuropathy. And if you didn't feel it, if you had a cut or a blister on the bottom of your foot and you didn't know it was there, you might not think about it, okay? It might get infected because of your impaired immune system, and it could lead to an infection called gangrene. Gangrene is awful, and it essentially leads to amputations. And again, diabetes is the leading cause of amputations in Canada. These sores and these diabetic blisters and these diabetic sores, they get severely infected, they don't heal, and eventually the only way to stop the infection from going into the blood and turning your body septic is to cut the limb off. Okay, so for many people, they get diabetes, type 1 diabetes as a child. There's nothing they can do about that, okay? But for most people who are developing diabetes today, it's type 2 diabetes, and it is preventable by making lifestyle changes.
When you hear the word insulin, you may think of a drug taken by people who have diabetes. While this is true, what you may not know is that insulin is one of the many hormones created in the human body. Insulin is important to the body. It allows blood sugar, or glucose, to get into cells to provide them with energy. When you eat, your body breaks down food into glucose in your small intestine. This is your body's source of energy for everything it does, from working and thinking to exercising and healing. Glucose travels through your bloodstream looking for individual cells that need energy. For glucose to get into the cells, it requires insulin. Insulin is the key that unlocks cells for glucose to enter and deliver energy. When insulin arrives, it signals the cell to activate glucose transporters. These transporters pull glucose through cell walls. When glucose moves into the cell, it delivers energy. Insulin is normally produced in the pancreas by specialized cells called beta cells. When glucose enters your bloodstream, the pancreas matches it with the right amount of insulin to move glucose into your cells. In people with diabetes, this process doesn't work as it should. In type 1 diabetes, scientists believe the body's immune system mistakenly attacks and destroys beta cells in the pancreas. A person with type 1 diabetes loses the ability to produce insulin. In type 2 diabetes, the pancreas is not producing enough insulin to meet the body's needs. Over time, the amount of insulin typically becomes less and less. In some type 2 diabetes patients, cells build up a resistance to insulin. Even though there may be insulin in the bloodstream, it is not enough to unlock cells to allow glucose to enter. As a result, it takes more insulin to find the right key to unlock the cell for glucose. This makes it more difficult for cells to get the energy they need. When glucose can't get into cells, either because there isn't enough insulin or because the body is resisting it, glucose begins to build up in the bloodstream. As a result, all that energy is wasted. It does not get to cells where it is needed. Without glucose in your cells, they lack the energy they require to keep your body working. To keep glucose from building up in the bloodstream, an external supply of insulin may be needed. Because people with type 1 diabetes can't produce their own insulin, they must inject insulin several times every day or receive insulin through an insulin pump. Many people with type 2 diabetes take insulin too. Injected insulin acts on glucose in a similar way to insulin the body would produce if it could. Like the body's insulin, injected insulin helps reduce the amount of glucose in the bloodstream by getting it into cells where it is needed for energy.
All right, so we added some hormones and glands to your list if you've been keeping track. With a chart as I recommended, you can add glucagon and insulin. Okay, glucagon is produced by the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans, and insulin is secreted by the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans, and the islets of Langerhans are found in the pancreas.